How can prayer help us conquer fear and despair? That's the topic we're going to be addressing today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. Flourish-Meant is sponsored by Access More. Today, I have a very special guest from all the way across the pond. He has an exciting project that will help us to focus more on how fear can be that answer to conquering fear and despair. His name is Richard Gamble. He is the visionary behind the colossal project, the Eternal Wall of Answered Prayer. And it is a monumental piece of public art revealing how Jesus has answered 1 million personal prayers. It will be the largest database of hope stories in the entire world. After becoming a Christian in 1990, Richard studied at Bible College. He has worked for British Gas before leaving the big corporate world to make his mark in entrepreneurship, co-founding both a software business and a marketing consultancy. He has a keen love of football. He became CEO of Sports Chaplaincy UK. He was the former chaplain of a city football club, and he is willing to help share incredible stories and bring this concept for the entire UK and the world, helping rally people behind the belief that one individual's answered prayer can be another person's hope. Welcome, Richard. I am so delighted to share this topic with you on Flourish-Meant today from all the way across the ocean.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
In this second portion of our conversation with Richard Gamble, the visionary behind the monument, the Eternal Wall of Answered Prayer, we're going to dive into some more practical ways that we can focus on prayer as a way of conquering our fear and despair. Richard, what would you say to that person who is struggling right now with fear and despair? How can they turn to prayer as a way to begin to overcome those fears, to pull out of that despair, and to recognize that there is a God who loves them?
Well, I think the Bible gives us a really good life hack for that. There's a really clear instruction from God of how we do that. And if you look at Psalm 77, for me, the psalmist wakes up in the middle of the night, because how many of us get those fears really kick in when we wake up in the middle of the night and our brains go? And he's at that point of fear. He's at that point of despair. And he's struggling and he's grappling to know what to do. And then he says, I remembered the deeds of the Lord. And he starts then to remind himself of what God has done in his life. And that's what I do personally, Tina. I've over all this stress, I've managed 13 sleepless nights, which I think is not too bad going considering the size of it. But what I do is this: I do a physical thing at night. I know when the disciples stepping out of the boat, and he's looking at Jesus walking on the water. But then it says he gets distracted by the storm and the wind and he starts to sink. So I think of it like this. I've got the storm on my left-hand side. So that's all the facts. Those are all the things that I'm worried about, the things that are piling up, which actually just feed fear. And then on my right-hand side, I imagine there's Jesus. So in bed, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I turn over to my right-hand side and I look at Jesus. And then in my mind, I remember all the things that he's done. And I believe that's recalibrating our minds and recalibrating our spirits to the truth. Because fear just sort of feeds on facts. But then if I remember, wait a second, God's for me, because when I was in need, he provided this for me. When I was sick, he healed me. And I recall all those situations. And then I sort of bring those up and go, now, how does that compare to these facts? He's bigger than all of those. It's going to be okay. And that's how I find my peace in Jesus.
And what you're saying is not being unrealistic. You're not taking yourself out of reality and saying, I'm going to ignore the facts. You're just not allowing the facts to come out of context and exaggerate themselves to be bigger than being in the context of the truth of who God is and what he's already done and what he's going to do in your life. So talk about the times when you were experiencing fear and despair yourself and you were able to focus on God to get through it. Because with this project this size, like you said, it was 19 years in the making and you're just now starting to build. That's a long time. And I'm sure that you had some struggles along the way, even just with that, even before that, you probably had some things. So talk about your own personal experience of overcoming fear and or despair by doing some of those things.
Yes, well, I think I'll take two different ones if that's okay. Because for me, despair is linked to hope. In Proverbs 13, it says, hope deferred makes the heart grow sick. So I really hated that scripture. Sorry to say this, but I really hated that scripture for some time. It was like, hope deferred makes the heart grow sick. And I'd be reading and going, Lord, I know my hope is deferred. My heart is sick. You're just telling me something I already know. But what I learned was, be careful where you put your hope. Because on the whole journey, I was like, oh, we'll be building by this year, or we'll have raised this much money. And my hope was in little points along the journey, instead of going, my hope is, and my belief is that Jesus is with me on this journey and we're going to get there. That's a much better place to put your hope in, because I know I'm not going to be disappointed. I'm 100% confident that God is in this, because we've seen so many miracles along the way. So I try to be very careful now where I place my hope, and that protects me from the despair. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I presented this project in Parliament 8 years ago, and one of the members of Parliament, so that's like equivalent to Congress, one of the members basically asked me, well, this is a great project, but how are you going to fund it? And I said, well, I've got a really big backer behind me. Who's gonna fund this project? And of course, they all thought of all these rich Christians that they knew, but the reality was, the person backing me was the one who owns 1,000 cattle on 1,000 hills. And I'm just very grateful that he didn't ask me who my backer was at that point. But the point of that is, that's where my hope is. My hope is not in one individual donor coming up. We need all of those, of course, but I believe that my hope is in him to provide, and he's going to introduce me to the right people that we need. In terms of how I cope with the fear, I think there are times, and I'll be honest with you, today is one of those days where a meeting's going on and it could absolutely scupper the whole project. But it can't, because God's in it. And so for me, the fear can just, it's like the consequences of the issues that get your head in trouble. Oh, if this happens, then this will happen, and then this will happen. And then your head can sort of get away with it itself, and your spirit can sort of start living in the future of bad consequences. And so what I do is, when I'm praying, I ask for peace. I believe that Jesus is my peace. So all I need to do is get close to Jesus. I don't sort of imagine a peace just like flooding me and just taking over. I've learned that the way to find that peace is getting really close to Jesus and just spending time with him. And what I do to combat the fear then is just recall the things that God has said to me about this project. And to recall, so I'll tell you one of the stories. We were praying for land. That's quite a big deal. I'd got nowhere to build this thing and £5 in the bank. And so we were invited, my wife and I were invited to a conference in California, and we went to it as a retreat. And this lady came up to us and she said, hey, God's told me He's got a word for you. And I was like, and nobody knew who we were or what we were doing. And she said, God wants you to know he's got some heavenly land for you. I mean, for me, that was so cool that I traveled halfway across the planet and God's spoken to me about the land that I was praying for. So one of my team, I tell my team in the UK, this is what God has said. And one of my team said, well, if God's told us he's got the land, I'll ask him where it is. And I just laughed and I went, okay. But then she sent me a Google map with a piece of land circled, and she said, this is the land. And what she didn't know was just a few days previous, the person who owned that land had emailed me and asked to meet with me. And so I know, wow, so I meet with this guy, and he doesn't give anything away. He's very stony faced. I sort of share the vision with him. And then he explains to me, God had spoken to me 19 years ago. He explains to me that 19 and a half years ago, God had spoken to him about the same vision. And so he said, I'm going to go and pray about giving you some land. But even then, I didn't tell him about the land that was circled. So he came back and he went, hey, I've given you a piece of land. I'm going to give you a piece of land. But it wasn't the one that was circled. So I was like, oh, great, I've got some land, happy days. But after 6 months, it didn't work for various reasons. So then he gave me another piece of land. And then after 6 months, that didn't work for various reasons. And then his father said to him, stop messing this guy about, give him the best land. So he paid an architect to look at all the land that he owned in the country. And the architect came back with the piece that the woman had circled. So that for me is an undeniable story of God at work. So I take that story and I remind myself and I tell other people that story. And I've got maybe 30, 40 stories like that. It's been incredible. But what those stories do is they build faith, they build truth in my life, and that helps me to cast out fear.
And it doesn't have to be a big piece of land or some kind of colossal thing to remind you that God is there and he sees you and he's answering your prayers and he's listening to you. But we do have to account those. We do have to record those and remind ourselves of those. And that is exactly why we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament, those stories where by verbal tradition, that by oral tradition, they're saying the stories of who God has been and who God is all the way through. He's the God of Israel. He's the God of Abraham. He's the God of Jacob. He's the God who led you out of Egypt, and all of those stories that they keep telling over and over. We need to do that too, don't we?
That's right, absolutely. And my wife and I, we have a little book and we write all the things down that God has done in our lives. And there have been times when we have sat around the tea table with the children and we're like, we need money right now, but let's just read these stories because this is what God has done, and we'll be okay. We'll be okay. And you know, I've heard of some people who get a jar, and every time God answers a prayer, they put a button in the jar or a stone in the jar. So when they're having those moments, they've got something physical that reminds them of all the times that God has heard their cry and responded. And I think you're absolutely right. Keep telling the stories, pass it down to the generations, but make things for yourself to remind yourself what God has done in your life. I have a friend who's got a massive stone by his driveway, because that's to remind him of God's awesome provision for his house. So every time he drives into his house, into his driveway, he sees the big stone and goes, yes, God's given me this house. And I think it's good to give ourselves those physical reminders, which of course is what Joshua did when they took the 12 stones from the Jordan and planted them at Gilgal. And effectively, that's what we're doing with Eternal Wall. We're just doing it with 1 million rather than 12.
Have you collected 1 million prayers, or are you still collecting them?
No, we are still collecting. So we currently have, our aim is to have 200,000 by the time we start. We have 36,726 to date. So many amazing stories coming in. And the idea is that we will light this monument up to the degree that we've got the answered prayers. So as it goes through time, it's just going to grow bit by bit by bit. And when we hit 1 million, we'll just change the color and light it up again. So we're constantly communicating to the world that is watching that Jesus is still alive. He's still listening and he's still answering.
That is such a fantastic concept. I cannot wait to see this get started. How can people partner with you and add their stories to your million wall of answered prayers, and also be part of that process of supporting you and getting that project going? You said you have already broken ground and you're getting ready to start building?
That's right. So yeah, if you go on to eternalwall.us, you can donate. That would be amazing to be part of this. And of course, because this is going to last for hundreds of years, it's something that you can tell your grandchildren, and they can tell their grandchildren that you were part of it. And then we're asking people to share their stories with us. You can write up to 500 words, or you can just record it on an audio or a video and just upload it so people can watch and hear your stories. So just go to eternalwall.us and you'll be able to do all of that. And here's the really, really exciting thing for me, Tina, is that in 100 years' time, we will all have gone home. But how exciting that somebody on this planet is going to read your story long after we've left Earth, and they're going to find the God who answers because they're inspired by the story that you've just given us 5 minutes of your time to share. And that's what I just want to encourage your listeners to do. Just give us 5 minutes and you're going to impact people for future generations.
So exciting. And I cannot wait for all of you listening to jump in and share your stories and be part of this amazing project. I hope that you will connect with Richard Gamble and the Eternal Wall of Answered Prayer. And of course, I hope that you will also come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant. Flourish-Meant is part of the Spark Media Network and can be found on the Edify app.